NCITE, the Center of Excellence for Department of Homeland Security. I'd like to welcome you to a talk with John Cohen about 6 months after the domestic terrorism strategy was released. The domestic terrorism strategy was released in kind of great fanfare. We had a attack or riot at the Capitol. A number of people have been arrested. A growing number of threats at domestic terrorism in this country. Just 2 years ago, the FBI had 1,000 active investigations. As of last month, they had 2,700. And so this is an issue that has been on the front pages of the news, but also the front pages and the thoughts of the counterterrorism professionals on these issues. And sometimes people move on, but I think Gina and myself, and particularly John, don't. And we wanted to take a step back and see where we're at after 6 months of the DT strategy. What are the lessons learned? Where are we in the threat picture and how we do things? And where do we go from here? I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Gina, in a moment, but just so we have a sense of the lay of the land of how this is going to go. Gina will introduce John. Mr. Cohen will then give a few opening remarks and then have a moderated question and answer from Gina and I. And then we're going to open up I might regret this, we're going to open it up to the public for a larger conversation about extremism in America. And so we will have questions coming in. So if you have questions, you can send them into the chat function. We'll look at those and then relay them to John. We're going to have a hard stop in 1 hour, given kind of a number of responsibilities that Mr. Cohen has to go from there. So again, I just want to thank you for attending this event. We will also be streaming live on YouTube, and it will be available shortly after, posted on there. Gina?
Yeah, thanks everyone. It's nice to see you both again. I think the last time I was with the two of you on screen like this was at our annual conference for NCITE in June, right after the national strategy was released. Just to share with the audience, NCITE is the federal government, serves the federal government to serve as the Counterterrorism and Terrorism Prevention Center of Excellence. It's an independent academic institution. It's based in Omaha, Nebraska. But we have 19 institutions all across the country and a couple in the UK, including George Washington University's program on extremism. So really the best minds in the country who are working on some of the thorny problems that we're going to hear about today. So those 60 researchers and 400 plus students who are part of this NCITE consortium that are supporting Department of Homeland Security are all tuning in today, along with members of the public, to hear from someone who has a really long career in law enforcement that helps us to be able to see just how many people it takes to keep us safe, and has been working this mission set his whole career. So from John Cohen's days as a police officer in Gardena, California, to holding the position where he is now, which is really Homeland Security's top counterterrorism official, he's really seen the spectrum of what it takes to fight terrorism and targeted violence. His career's given him a window into the threats that we all face. And what I really like about him is he's just been a willing and frank speaker to all of us to let us know what we're doing well, but also what threats we're missing and what we could do better on. So I'd like to turn the mic over to John Cohen now so we can hear from him directly and then get right into the audience questions. Mr. Cohen?
Seamus, Gina, it's great to be with you again. It's hard to believe that it was in June when we had our first conversation on this issue. And I'd like to be able to say that we have risen to the challenge and that we have fully addressed the threat and the complex threat that we were discussing back in June. But what I can say, I can't say that, but what I can say is we've made progress. We're continuing to make progress on a day-to-day basis, but we still have a ways to go. If I may, I'd like to spend a few short minutes talking a little bit about where we are from a threat perspective, talk a little bit about what has been accomplished and where we still need to focus. As a nation, we continue to face a threat environment that is dynamic, complex, and highly volatile. In some respects, I would say the threat is more volatile than it was back in June. We continue to experience unacceptable levels of violence by individuals and small groups who are inspired by a blend of ideological beliefs or personal grievances or a combination of both. They come to those beliefs or formulate those grievances primarily through the consumption of online content. And in many cases, the online content they are viewing has been placed there by foreign intelligence services, foreign terrorist organizations, domestic violent extremist thought leaders for the express purposes of sowing discord and in the hopes that those who are vulnerable in our society to being influenced to engage in violence will do so. What makes the environment more volatile from my perspective is that the narratives that are being promoted by these threat actors are rapidly finding their way into the mainstream media ecosystem, where they're being amplified by public figures in the media, in government, and that brings further validation to these narratives that are being expressly introduced by threat actors or amplified by threat actors for the objective of engaging in malign, illegal, or intelligence operational objectives. It's still an individualized threat. While we do see some organizations or groups of people who coalesce around specific ideological beliefs, from a perspective of lethal acts of violence, it still tends to be individuals who, again, self-connect with an ideological cause, a blend of ideological beliefs, and or personal grievances to justify their use of violence as a way to express their anger. This is also a threat that doesn't fit into those neat definitional categories that those of us in law enforcement or in the intelligence world depend on or have historically depended on in order to define a threat and a course of action associated with the threat. And that is a real challenge because it impacts the ability of federal task forces, law enforcement in general, and even intelligence analysts to categorize the type of threat-related activity that may be observed, in a community somewhere in the country. And that has actually resulted in circumstances where individuals have come to the attention of law enforcement or come to the attention of local officials. And because of the difficulty in categorizing whether this was a personally grievance-motivated attack or a threat or an ideologically motivated threat, it's resulted in inaction. And we've actually seen lethal attacks by individuals who had come to the attention of law enforcement previously, but did not reach the threshold of a counterterrorism investigation or a law enforcement action. On a good news front, though, we have actually seen a number of attacks thwarted. And we have seen instances where individuals in schools or in the work environment or in communities have observed suspicious activities or behaviors of concern, whether it be online or whether they were exhibited in the physical environment. They made authorities aware of those concerns, and actions were taken in order to minimize the threat. I was involved in a call yesterday with state and local law enforcement officials around the country, and they talked about their concerns regarding an increase in threats of mass casualty attacks in schools. But what was most interesting to me about it was that as they were disrupting these plots and describing the strategies they were employing, in some cases it was traditional law enforcement investigations, but in a significant number it was providing access to mental health services for troubled individuals. And they were able to minimize the risk posed by those individuals by connecting them with that care. So that tells me that some of the work that we talked about and some of the objectives that we talked about last June, are beginning to take hold. So let me spend a few moments and talk about what we've done since June to further the President's strategy. We are working from the Department of Homeland Security. We are working more closely with the FBI than any time in recent history. I personally am communicating with senior leadership. My analysts are communicating with their colleagues. We're engaged in joint analytic efforts. We coordinate all of our outreach with state and local authorities with the private sector, with non-government organizations. We're doing it together. We have a common understanding of the threat. We recognize where the department's activities complement the law enforcement and investigative activities of the Bureau, and that close partnership is only growing. Our information sharing and collaboration with state and local officials has increased as well. We engage in regular calls with state and local authorities around the country to not only exchange information, threat-related information that we're seeing, but to hear from them, to hear what they're doing, what they're seeing in their communities, so we can incorporate that into our analysis. We have awarded under our prevention programs initiative $20 million in community-based prevention grants. These are grants that are intended to explore innovative approaches to building resilience to online content or engaging at the community level in prevention-related activities. The hope is that we will identify approaches to violence prevention that can then be replicated across the country. We've expanded our ability to evaluate online activity, again, whether it be activity by a foreign intelligence service, a foreign terrorist organization, activity that's taking place within online communities associated with domestic violent extremist groups. And we are improving our ability to assess that activity which is threat-related and differentiate that from activity that may be constitutionally protected. And if I can take a second just to emphasize that point, one of the areas where we've spent a lot of time and we've made huge progress is working with civil rights and civil liberties organizations, our privacy office, the lawyers that work across the federal government to take on and understand the complexities that are associated with looking at online behavior, that some of which may be constitutionally protected speech, and evaluating that which is constitutionally protected and that which is threat-related. Because our job, as I pointed out last time we met, is not to police thought. Our job is to prevent acts of violence. And making sure that our analysts are looking at online activity in a way that differentiates between protected speech and potential threat-related activity is a top priority. We're working with state and local organizations to expand their ability to engage in threat assessment investigations and threat management activities, particularly threat management activities that bring together law enforcement, mental health professionals, faith leaders, social service providers, educators, and community-based prevention organizations. What we are finding is, regardless of whether the motive behind a potential threat is ideological or personal grievance-based, those strategies, those violence prevention activities are the best way that we can protect our communities. What bothers me today is that 6 months after our conversation, we do not yet have, across the United States, a consistent level of capability that is designed to enable threat assessment and threat management activities at the local level. It's a top priority for Secretary Mayorkas here at the department to ensure that the department does everything it can through providing training, analysis, technical assistance, and grant funding to local communities so that they can bring together the right resources and the right disciplines and the right operational frameworks and put in place the right operational frameworks in order to enable that type of activity consistently across the country. Now, while I'm describing all of that, I'm also mindful that in the 6 months since we last spoke, we're dealing with a variety of other threat-related issues that impact the department. Communities across the country are in the midst of a multi-year increase in violent crime. Some of it's being driven by illicit drug flows coming in to the United States from abroad. We are dealing with evolving patterns of migration. There is a significant cyber-related threat to private and government systems around the country, increases in ransomware attacks. We're dealing with an evolving foreign terrorist threat. Countries that have historically been safe havens for terrorism are going through periods of transition. We're not sure how that's going to play out. And so we're watching carefully whether these countries become areas of or bases of for operation or media operations by foreign terrorist organizations. We're seeing an increase in online activity by foreign terrorist organizations who are increasingly calling for attacks in the West and in particular the U.S. And are promoting or posting more graphic content in hopes of inspiring attacks by lone offenders in the West. And we are seeing a significant level of activity by foreign intelligence organizations who are seeking to collect sensitive information from U.S. universities, businesses, governments, or engage in covert activities. And these activities include the use of influence operations and disinformation campaigns specifically intended to sow discord, destabilize our society, undermine the credibility and confidence in our government institutions, and disrupt our relationships with NATO allies. So while dealing with the issue of domestic terrorism and domestic violent extremism is a top priority for the department, we're dealing with that at the same time. We're dealing with several other threats. And I would just point out that particularly in that last category of activity, the activity of foreign intelligence organizations, we're seeing a commingling of activities. I mean, if you look at the narratives that are being promoted by some foreign nation-state intelligence services as they are seeking to use online platforms to accomplish their influence operational objectives, they're focusing on narratives such as the U.S. government response to COVID. They're focusing on issues of race and immigration and racial justice. They are focusing on issues relating to the 2020 presidential election, promoting narratives that the election was rigged or stolen, and other conspiracy theories associated with that election. They're promoting narratives specifically intended to disrupt our relationship with our NATO allies. So it's not only that we're dealing with this complex and volatile threat environment, but in some respects, the different elements of the threat commingle with and are integrated with the threat posed by individuals in the U.S. who are engaging in acts of targeted violence or mass casualty attacks. So I will leave it there, and I will turn it over to you all and submit myself to your questioning.
No, that's really helpful. I'll take the liberty of asking the first question based on something you said in your talk. It's a little disheartening, I guess, to hear that you perceive that the threat is more complex and more volatile in the last 6 months. And so if you could speak to how your organization is prioritizing which threat we should attend to and how should we as academics?
I mean, the bottom line is we have to attend to them all. Each day, I'm meeting with the analysts that work in the Office of Intelligence and Analysis here at DHS. I'm meeting with representatives from the interagency, with people in academia and outside of government to deal with all of these threats. So it's kind of hard for me to answer that question. I will tell you that what seems to be an integral part of each of those threats that I mentioned to you is the impact that online platforms or the use of online platforms by criminal organizations, terrorist organizations, domestic violent extremist thought leaders, and foreign intelligence services plays in all of those threats. Every threat that I mentioned before, there's an element to it where online platforms, whether it be social media or others, are being leveraged by those threat actors to accomplish their operational objectives, whether it's grooming an individual for sex trafficking or human smuggling, whether it's eliciting individuals to contact a smuggler so that they can be part of a mass migratory caravan movement, or whether it's the efforts of a foreign terrorist group, a foreign intelligence service, or a domestic violent extremist group to inspire acts of violence in the U.S. They're all leveraging not only the similar strategies online, but they're leveraging the same playbook.
Yep. No, that's good guidance. Seamus?
Yeah, I got to say, John, that was one of the most honest kind of assessments of threats I've seen in the public sector or the public sphere in quite a while. Disheartening, but also refreshing in terms of what we're seeing both in our research, but in the public at large, in terms of a more volatile threat, and also the interesting point about kind of commingling of domestic extremism and foreign actors in terms of trying to enhance and add accelerant to an already volatile situation. So First of all, thank you for that. I want to turn, just given that we're coming up on the anniversary of January 6th, I think it's important to touch on that a little bit. We're getting something north of 700 people who have been charged with federal crimes related to that day. How does, I got a sense when you all released the strategy that January 6th helped push along a little bit a timeline that was in place but accelerated because of the events of January 6th. But how does that type of violence and the lead up to that inform what DHS is doing and how to address those type of things? And then the other thing, and probably most important as we think about this, is how concerned should the public be about the anniversary, or what's the threat picture look like for that? And how does law enforcement and the counterterrorism professionals writ large, how are they kind of positioning themselves for that anniversary?
Yeah, so I think from the standpoint of what we will see on January 6, 2022, I think, we're still evaluating that. But what has changed since last January 6th is significant. The way we look at intelligence is different. The way we look at public information is different. We used to believe that credible intelligence was only that intelligence which came through the use of sensitive collection platforms. What we learned from January 6th was information and intelligence that may provide insights into an evolving threat may be out in the open. And as we look at the playbook that's being used by those who are seeking to inspire acts of violence, such as that which we saw on January 6th, they need these narratives to spread across the broadest spectrum of platforms as possible, so that it needs to be public. What wasn't happening is we weren't taking that information into account when we were not only thinking about a threat, but when we were taking steps to mitigate that threat. So what's different today? We are more focused on looking at information that's being introduced or amplified on the various threat actor-related platforms. And we are incorporating that understanding into security and law enforcement planning. And I can give you an example. On September 18th this year, in the weeks leading up to September 18th, we were beginning to see conversations focusing on a planned demonstration in D.C. In which the demonstrators intended to show their support for those arrested on January 6th. In the early stages of our evaluation of that activity, we found mostly the calls to be for peaceful demonstrations. So we didn't collect on that, and we weren't even engaging in any type of analytical activity on that event. Law enforcement agencies were aware of it. They were planning for it from a public safety perspective, but from the perspective of the DHS, it really wasn't something that we were paying an inordinate amount of attention to. But that changed when we began to see woven into the communications and conversation threads on these same platforms calls for kidnappings of members of Congress, calls for attacks at, quote, liberal churches, unquote, attacks against Jewish facilities in Washington, D.C., calls for violent interactions with between counter-protesters and those coming to demonstrate their support for those arrested for engaging in the insurrection on January 6th. And once we saw those calls for violence, that's when we began looking at that information more closely, evaluating that information, and we took that information and we shared it along with the FBI, with state and local authorities, the Park Police, and others. And as a result, operational plans were developed in order to mitigate the potential for violence associated with the events planned for that day. Now, what's interesting about that is we did that very publicly. We talked about what we were seeing publicly. We talked about the security planning very publicly. And what we began seeing reflected in these same forums was recognition that security was going to be increased, and that perhaps this wasn't the time for them to for those folks who were intending to commit acts of violence to come to Washington and engage in violence. And what essentially happened was a very low-profile event. So to me, that's instructive, right? I mean, we can talk later about all the societal changes that need to come about in order for us to deal with the issues that we're facing today. But from a very tactical security perspective, recognizing calls for violence that are occurring on these platforms, incorporating that into our security planning, sharing that information with state and local authorities so they can incorporate these planned events or these potential threats into their security planning, doing it in a very visible way so that those who may be seeking to come here are aware that we're aware and are deterred from doing so.
You know, that public awareness campaign that you all do, it's interesting. We've seen an increase in the NTAS, the National Threat Advisory System bulletins that you all send, and also the amount of detail in them. They've picked up in frequency and sort of the detail that's going out to the general public. Is that part of that strategy? And you know, how do you balance, you know, the public not getting desensitized to the heightened threat that you know to be true, and our need to be aware of our surroundings and what this threat looks like?
Yeah, Gina, that's a really good question. It is part of the strategy. Secretary Mayorkas gave us 2 pieces of instruction. Make sure we're telling in the NTAS, as it relates to NTAS, make sure we're telling the public what we're concerned about, and and I guess it's 3 things. Make sure we tell them what we're concerned about, tell them what we're doing about it, and tell them what we want them to do about it. So I think as the NTASs, the advisories have evolved through the course of the year, we have tried to make them more detailed so that we could give the public an accurate perspective of what we're seeing, what we're concerned about, what we're doing, and what they should do. Your point about, about apathy or the public sort of beginning to turn off, it's a huge issue. But I think what's a bigger issue, quite frankly, is there's a significant portion of the public, particularly that public that consumes information about events, whether it be COVID, the election, race in America, immigration, from certain specific sources that are being misinformed on a day-to-day basis by the huge amount of conspiracy theories and disinformation that are shared that are introduced into the ecosystem on a daily basis by these threat actors. And trying to educate the public that depending on where they get their information, they may be specifically being targeted with disinformation. That is the biggest challenge we're facing right now, because for a subset of our population, they're not gonna believe what the government's telling them. So one of the questions we're asking ourselves, in addition to NTASs and to the bulletins we send out and the public education activities we try to accomplish through interactions such as this and participation on events such as this, is what other organizations, what are the other vehicles that we can leverage in order to inform the public that what they may be hearing on their cable news station or through their social media feeds or their participation on platforms, certain platforms, is intentionally being fed to them for the purposes of misinforming them. And in many cases, it may just result in someone being angry and holding a view that's based on inaccurate information. But in other cases, it may cause them not to take steps that could save them or impact their personal health because it may save them from being exposed or becoming ill from COVID-19 or some other communicable diseases. And in some cases, it actually serves as the source of inspiration for people to commit acts of violence.
I want to pick up a little bit on that inspiring people to commit acts of violence. And I wonder if we talk a little bit about the threat picture as we define it, right? And I wonder whether we're putting things in boxes of which they don't exist anymore, right? The ISIS threat, the Al-Qaeda threat, the domestic terrorism threat, right? But these ideologies, we're seeing more kind of targeted violence and a bit of kind of mixing of things, which makes things a little bit harder, right? So you can't train up your analyst on what to look for white supremacy, and also you have to train up on ISIS, and also have to train up on Hezbollah and far left and everything in between. And you have to kind of get all of your folks smart as quick as possible on a whole range of ways to look at that. Is that what we're looking at in terms of where things are going, or am I just wildly off on the way this looks at?
No, I mean, I think that's certainly a key part of the threat environment. Look, there's still terrorist organizations out there, right? There are still foreign nation states who engage in asymmetric or hybrid forms of warfare where they seek to achieve their geopolitical objectives on behalf of their nation state through the use of information warfare, cyber warfare, and other forms of asymmetric or non-conventional military and intelligence operations. But as I mentioned earlier, this is a very individualized threat. And, there is a very wise person who once said, ultimately, the decision to engage in violence on behalf of a cognitive or emotional belief is a psychological process. And that's really a key thought. That's Gina who said that, because I couldn't say something as eloquent as that. But it's very true, because in many respects, and I think I mentioned this last time we spoke, there was an assistant director in the FBI several years back who said the primary threat facing the nation today is that we have a lot of angry people who are seeking for a justification to use violence as a way to express that anger. So when we come across individuals who are promoting the ideological beliefs of white supremacy and of ISIS, and they photograph themselves with a neo-Nazi flag next to an ISIS flag, or we have individuals who embrace an individualized ideological belief system that blends incel beliefs with white supremacist beliefs, with anarchist beliefs, that makes it difficult, if you're thinking about these problems traditionally, for an analyst or for a law enforcement investigator to wrap their arms around what they're actually seeing. We've already seen examples where law enforcement has responded. This is the case in Indianapolis, where law enforcement responded to a crisis intervention call, a mother concerned that their son may be suicidal, while they were engaging with the family and placing the son ultimately in a 72-hour psychiatric evaluation hold. They noticed what was potentially extremist material on his computer. The JTTF came in. The individual did not meet the threshold for a JTTF investigation. After the individual was released from their 72-hour hold, several months later, they went out and committed a mass casualty attack. That is not the exception. That tends to be very consistent with the fact pattern for a number of events that we're seeing. So when I referenced earlier that we are seeing success stories, we are seeing examples where individuals do come to the attention of local authorities. They do engage in threat assessment activities. They look at holistically at the behaviors of the individual, and they are able to work with mental health professionals to assess whether those behaviors reflect a high-risk individual or a person who poses a high risk for violence, and then they develop a plan to manage that threat. That's the paradigm that we're looking at today. I guess my concern is that there are some in the federal government who are still playing catch-up. Because this doesn't, to your point, fit sort of the traditional terrorism or nation-state threat definition, it sometimes it's a little bit of a challenge to get folks to understand how this fits into the current threat environment.
It's messy. It's a messy threat we're looking at right now. So,
but the nuanced threat.
Yeah,
it's a nuanced threat.
It's and just thinking through the challenge that the organization you lead right now at INA, who's organized either regionally or against the threat, is just interesting to think through how that complexity gets played out. So thanks for speaking to that. I will ask a question about. No, go ahead.
On that point, though, you asked me last time what makes me optimistic about things, and I talked about how, how each week I continue to teach, and each week, I engage with my students, and that makes me optimistic about the future when I see their passion and their commitment. That still remains in effect, but I'll tell you something else. So since our last conversation, I took over at INA in an acting capacity, intelligence and analysis. And when I see the commitment and the talent and the passion of the people who work in this organization, who come here every day and are trying to wrap their heads around a problem that is very complex, that is very nuanced, and they're doing so in an environment that doesn't always lend itself to deal with complex and nuanced issues. That makes me optimistic. We will get this right. We will get this right, and we are steadily making improvement across the country in our ability to address this threat, but it is complicated, and there's a lot of very serious issues that we have to take into account, particularly as it relates to protected speech and constitutionally protected behavior and its relationship with threat-related behavior. So it's a tough issue, it's a nuanced issue, it's a complicated issue, but seeing the commitment of the people who are trying to resolve these issues, that makes me optimistic.
Yeah, I think, as an org psychologist, my training, one of the things I always hear people talk about DHS is it's such a young organization, right? And compared to other elements in the IC, so young, so new. But I think in this case, in this threat environment, that has actually been a benefit to you all because you're being able to be more innovative and more flexible. And just the analysts that I get to see in action, their ability to work together is not in the silos that you see in older organizations, which has been really refreshing from an academic standpoint, just on the outside looking in. So I appreciate you.
I agree. I think that's right. I mean, in order to understand the current threat environment, again, whether you're an analyst working on on economic issues, on terrorism issues, on counterintelligence issues, you have to both understand the digital world and the physical threat world. Yes, it's helpful to know how the Soviet Union operated, particularly in their active measures program, because that gives you some foundation into the playbook that Russia and other countries and even terrorist organizations are using when they engage in influence operations. But if you don't understand how the technology works, if you're not immersed in this sort of the digital environment, it's going to be complicated because it's a huge part of how our society behaves and operates and how these threat actors operate.
Yeah, I think about even just you being willing to talk to us publicly like this. I mean, I think Seamus and I have tried to get other leaders in the IC community to speak in this kind of forum, and having your frankness to talk about these issues is great. So I would like to just turn to something on the American public's mind about the holiday threat. One of the things that DHS does really well is looking at these strategic trends. And is this year's holiday threat sort of the same steady state as what we've seen in previous years? I mean, as terrorism researchers, we know that there's an increased kind of target attractiveness for doing something around the holidays for lots of different actors. And are you seeing it steady state, or do we have any new threats that we should be worried about this year?
So, what you will hear from the federal government, which is true, is that we don't have any specific or credible intelligence that points to a specific plot in the directed at locations in the United States during the holiday period. That said, if you look back at every lethal attack over the past, say, 3 or 4 years, I think you could say that we didn't have any specific or credible intelligence that forewarned of those events. Though, again, as a parenthetical, there were indicators. It just wasn't traditional intelligence. That said, there are several issues that concern us about the holiday period. One, it's the steady state of threat that I've described. We have those from a domestic violent extremism perspective who are motivated by a variety of narratives right now, to include COVID, the 2020 presidential election and conspiracy theories, race issues, immigration issues. They're being, those narratives are out there. There are calls for violence. Secondly, we're seeing increased activity on the foreign terrorist front, where there are similar calls for lone wolf attacks in Europe and the United States. What is different about the holiday season, particularly this holiday season, where people are really kind of tired of being cooped up because of COVID, is that you have places and occasions where large groups of people congregate, whether it's a open-air Christmas market or holiday parties or holiday events. So in our conversations with state and local authorities, with federal authorities, and others, what we're saying is, we're not necessarily seeing new information about new plots, but during the holiday season, there are going to be more opportunities potentially for those who may be looking to conduct an attack to conduct it. So our general message is enjoy the holidays, right? Employ public health protections, be smart, but enjoy the holidays. Go out, do what you're going to do, but be aware. Be aware of your surroundings. Take a moment and think about if something were to happen, what would you do? Or if you see something that you believe is suspicious, contact local authorities. Be aware. Don't be scared, but do be aware.
So we talked a lot about counterterrorism, but I wanted to shift a little bit to prevention. And it feels like history has an ability to rhyme a bit on this. And so I think back to my time in government, 5 or 10 years ago, and the focus on this concept of countering violent extremism or prevention or whatever you want to call it, resiliency or things like that. There was a strong pushback by civil rights and civil liberties organizations at the time with their concern, a number of concerns, but chief among them was a singular focus on one form of extremism. But at the same time, post January 6th, you're getting a kind of a push and pull right now. Congress is pushing you more funding, encouraging you to do more prevention work so you can stop folks before they commit a violent act or potentially commit a violent act. At the same time, you're getting kind of pulls from civil rights, civil liberties organizations saying, like, listen, this is government policing of thought and overreach. And so how do you square that circle, and where do you think DHS is going to go on this idea of prevention?
So you raised some really good points. I mean, as I look back at the strategies we developed for under countering violent extremism back in 2012, 2013, we did not have, and I can say this candidly because I was a part of that process, we did not have the level of research and analysis that we have today regarding the dynamics of the threat. And I can also say that some of our underlying assumptions regarding the threat were wrong. And specifically what I mean is it was our belief at that time that our primary concern needed to be individuals within the Arab American and Muslim community who would become radicalized by extremist personalities and who were susceptible to being influenced. And so we developed a whole strategy based on working with more moderate elements of those communities so that they could, in a sense, identify people who may be traveling down the pathway of radicalization to violence and educate them. But here's what we learned through academic research, peer review research, extensive analysis, is that individuals who were traveling down the pathway toward violence didn't come from one religious or ethnic or socioeconomic community. They came from a broad cross-sections of community. They tended to be relatively ignorant on the ideology they self-connected with, that they tended to connect with multiple ideologies. Sitting somebody down who was traveling down the pathway of radicalization to violence with a moderate imam wasn't going to work because the person wasn't seeking to engage on behalf of Islam. They were angry and they were looking for a justification to use violence as a way to express that anger. And they were really searching for a sense of social connection and life accomplishment. And in a somewhat perverse way, they were going to derive that by engaging in violence on behalf of a cause that they really didn't understand. So we also underestimated the amount of distrust that existed within some communities and with the department specifically and law enforcement generally. So the approach we're taking today is very, very different. It's a public health model. It's an approach that's based on public health, right? A public health model is you identify, you contain, and then you manage the risk. And we are working with a broad cross-section of communities we're looking to focus our activities on a broad cross-sections of communities. We are focusing on community-based prevention programs, particularly those that have worked in dealing with a broad cross-section of violent activity. We recognize the impact that the internet has on the threat environment, and we're working to build resilience, particularly with school-age people, to online hate. So it's a very, very different approach. But here's the challenge. That distrust that existed in 2012 and 2013 exists today. And in some cases, it may be worse because of policies that were employed by the department and by others in government over the course of the last administration. So there's a certain, within some communities, there's still a degree of skepticism and, again, trust, which sometimes presents challenges as we are seeking to roll out these programs. You know, ironically, the foundation to the approach that we're taking today is based on concepts and ideas that were promoted by groups like the Muslim Public Affairs Council and other civil rights and civil liberties organizations when we were trying to promote the CVE strategies. The challenge is that, again, that in some respects, there is still lingering doubts and distrust directed at the department. I think the other thing that's challenging is that the communities that distrust us the most are the communities that are being targeted today for violence. There's an increase in violence being directed at communities of color, immigrant communities, specific communities because of the faith of that community. And so our challenge is not only to design a good program, a program that is effective at preventing violence, but rebuilding that trust with those communities so that they're willing to work with us in partnership to implement those programs.
I'm a man of the people, and so I asked the people for questions and they responded, and so thank you, my people. But I'm also going to kind of relay the questions and not kind of sugarcoat any of them, and we've gotten a lot of interesting ones. So mentally prepare yourself. So let's go through a few of them, and if you have more, please feel free to ask them in the question and answer section of the Zoom. The first question is a pretty timely one, given the prosecution or the charging of 11 individuals in San Diego as it relates to far left extremism, and kind of the events of the Proud Boys and self-described Antifa members kind of fighting amongst themselves or not, depending on how you look at the versions of those events. How do you look at kind of that picture a little bit? And how does the department kind of touch those issues? And then, just given that we're on time, I'll ask another question. You can choose which one you want to answer or answer them both. What is the role of fusion centers in all of this in terms of domestic extremism or countering domestic terrorism writ large?
The first question I can answer very quickly. At the department, we are ideologically agnostic. We are focusing on violence. It doesn't matter to me, and I actually will protect the right of people to hold beliefs and even the right to hold extremist beliefs. But if those beliefs serve as the motivation for an act of violence or criminal activity, then you are going to be the focus of our attention, and you're going to be the focus of law enforcement attention. So it's the focus on violence, not ideology. I spend a lot of time trying to answer questions where I'm asked, well, which extremist ideology is more of a threat? What I'm concerned about isn't so much what the specific belief is, but whether that belief is inspiring a potential act of violence or other illegal activity. Secondly, the role of fusion centers. Fusion centers are critical to the work that we do at the department. These are state and locally owned analytic institutions that bring together a cross-section of law enforcement representatives. They are able to take national intelligence, place that intelligence into perspective from the local environment or into context based on the local environment, And they are also hubs that can gather information through their interactions with local organizations and provide that to national level authorities. So, fusion centers are critically important to our ability to protect the homeland.
I might ask a question that came from a viewer in Washington. So we've got some West Coast folks on here. They're talking about shunting on the railroads and the attacks that are happening from eco-terrorists and folks who were, there was just a sentence, an arrest that happened. Reich and Brooks were convicted, and it looks like Reich is going to be in Bellingham, Washington. A woman is going to be sentenced in a couple days. Also Union Pacific's here in Omaha, big railroad. And so it's interesting because, terrorists love transportation targets. Are you seeing any trends or changes in their tactics at this part of our critical infrastructure? It's, really important for our supply chain, but also just looking at transportation, critical infrastructure and trends you're seeing there from a threat perspective.
We could have a whole nother hour on that topic. I think that we pay close attention to potential threats to critical infrastructure, whether they be physical or cyber related. And we are concerned about multiple threat actors, whether they be domestic extremists, foreign terrorist groups, or even foreign nation states and their interest in our critical infrastructure, whether it's part of the transportation infrastructure, the supply chain infrastructure, or other elements of our critical infrastructure. So we could have a whole nother conversation on that, but we're very cognizant of it, both from a perspective of physical threats and mitigating those physical threats, and in particular cyber threats. Not just cyber threats that are seeking to disrupt information sharing capabilities or information management capabilities of the critical infrastructure, but cyber threats that could potentially cause physical damage or physical harm.
So we're getting a number of questions about some of your opening remarks, not only the volatile nature of the threat, but you touched ever so slightly on the role of kind of foreign influence in that. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, one of the questions is, how sophisticated is that, those campaigns in terms of targeting of Americans? How persistent are they? And what's the traction they may be getting?
They're highly sophisticated, they're highly persistent, but people need to understand what these adversaries are doing. They study our country, they understand the fractures in our society, they're seeking to exploit those fractures by introducing or amplifying narratives they know will not only cause vigorous public debate, but also potentially inspire malign or malicious or violent actions. So it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody that as we look at foreign nation states like Russia, China, Iran, those who are seeking to achieve their geopolitical objectives to the detriment of the United States, they're focusing on narratives such as those focusing on government overreach and COVID. They're focusing on promoting conspiracy theories regarding the 2020 election. They're focusing on narratives relating to race, and in particular, use of force by law enforcement. Why are they picking those narratives? Because they know that those narratives get to the very heart of the tribal and polarized nature of our political discourse. Now, what's also important for people to understand is these adversaries are not simply trying to introduce or amplify these narratives on discrete platforms. They are trying to have their conspiracy theories or their narratives spread across the broadest platform base as possible. So they may introduce these narratives using covert proxy websites or social media platforms or even more closed or private platforms. But their objective is to get it out there, not only broadly on social media, but have these narratives picked up by mainstream media sources. And so what troubles me, I think this is really important for people to understand, that when public figures in the media or elected officials mimic or amplify the narratives being promoted by foreign terrorist groups or foreign intelligence services, they are actually adding to the volatility of the threat environment. Now, their objective may be political or ratings-based, but in the current threat environment, the broader that these narratives are shared and spread, the higher the likelihood that they will be consumed by an individual who will use it as a justification for violence. And quite frankly, until we get a handle on that element of this, until more Americans understand that this is a technique that's being used by our adversaries, and they are specifically seeking to undermine, to destabilize the country or to inspire acts of violence or to undermine confidence in our government, and they start to question more the information that they're seeing on these social media platforms or other online platforms, or they're hearing about from others, until we get a true commitment across the political spectrum in the United States that we're going to employ a whole of society approach to dealing with this issue, the volatility of the threat environment is not going to change.
So building on that, I'm going to roll up, I think there's probably 7 questions into one for our last question, so we can make sure we're good stewards of your time. There's a lot of questions in the chat about misinformation and sort of what government organization or body is charged with studying that, countering that for U.S. persons, right? So we think a lot about like what the GEC is doing internationally, but there is evidence in what you're describing, and also just in open source that foreign adversaries are targeting us, and they are trying to foment discord through this misinformation campaign, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, using the GRU playbook, right? And so who's watching that, and what are going to be some of the solutions that you can see from a priority standpoint for us to take on?
It's still a work in progress. There's active discussions going on at the interagency level about how to structure. There is a very legitimate reticence on members of the intelligence community to look at these platforms, particularly domestic platforms. The FBI has certain authorities relating to their conduct of investigations that allow them to carry out some activities associated with this. We at DHS have authorities that allow us to look at these platforms. We're working closer together. We're sharing more and more analysis. What's particularly interesting is the sharing of analysis by members of the IC that focus on the activities of foreign state and non-state actors, when we can, in leveraging that to identify what may be going on here domestically from a counterintelligence perspective. So there's closer and closer collaboration, but I don't want to sit here and say that we've yet developed a cohesive organizational structure and specifically identified a single entity that's responsible for it, similar to the GEC. So that is a priority to do, though. But I also don't want people to think that we're just sort of closing our eyes and hoping the problem will go away. There's a lot of work that's going on, and quite frankly, there's been multiple instances. There's been multiple instances where, because of the great analysis that's being done at the FBI, at DHS, in the IC, where we've been able to mitigate the risk of violence posed by the introduction of some of these online narratives and conspiracy theories.
So, like clockwork, it's 3 o'clock, and so we should get credit for that. Full stop. But I want to kind of rehash a few things that Mr. Cohen's talked about. The threat is more volatile in recent months, more persistent, more mixed in terms of ideologies, and just frankly more complex in general. A bit of a mess, to put it frankly. But there are some things to be hopeful about in terms of DHS's posture on these type of things, the plussing up of resources both from Congress and other places, and then just a general focus that has been lacking, to be fair, in recent years on these issues. So, John, I want to thank you for your candor on this. Sometimes when we do these type of events, we kind of get the canned talking points that people like, I guess, but I don't. I actually like to have an actual conversation about where we at and kind of how can we address it from a policy perspective, and also, what's the role of academia and the public at large at rolling up our sleeves and doing this. So on behalf of the program on extremism, on behalf of Gina and the rest of the team at NCITE, I want to thank you for your time today. I apologize to the public. We got about 24 questions and we got through about 6 or 7 of them, which is a reflection of an engaging speaker. Just for a note of housekeeping, this talk will be available on our YouTube channel in about 5 to 10 minutes. So please don't hate me, rest of the team at Program Extremism. And I would encourage people to look at it as we go through. And then, John, I hate to tell you this, but I think you're gonna be on the hook again in a few months to see where we're at in 6 months from 6 months from now and go from there. And I hope we can continue kind of a regular pattern for it. So thank you very much for everyone for joining us.